Wyoming Territory, 1883. The first winter snow fell soft as a whisper across the valley, but Caleb Kincaid knew better than to trust its gentle appearance. Like most beautiful things in this unforgiving territory, what looked peaceful could kill a man just as dead as any bullet. He pulled his sheepskin collar higher against the chill and squinted at the darkening horizon, gauging how much daylight remained before he'd need to make camp. At 26, Caleb had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. The war had taken his father, the fever his mother, and the frontier had claimed whatever innocence remained after that. Now he drifted between ranch jobs, selling his skill with horses and cattle to whoever paid fair and asked few questions. The arrangement suited him, no attachments meant no disappointments. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and enough sense to stay alive, his father had told him once, words Caleb had transformed into a creed after burying everyone he'd ever loved. The frontier was no place for tender feelings. Sentiment was a luxury as impractical as silk shirts and cologne. He spotted the smoke first, a thin gray line against the darkening sky, then the small cabin nestled against the protective shoulder of a hillside. Caleb hesitated. He preferred sleeping under the stars to facing strangers, but the temperature was dropping fast, and his gelding needed shelter from the coming storm. The decision made itself when fat flakes began falling in earnest. Caleb approached cautiously, one hand resting near his holstered Colt. As he drew closer, he noticed the neat stack of firewood, the well-swept porch, the small corral with a single dappled mare. Someone lived here permanently, not just a trapper or prospector passing through. Before he could call out, the cabin door swung open. Framed in golden lamplight stood a young woman, a rifle held confidently but not yet raised. Her eyes, clear and watchful, assessed him from beneath a sweep of dark lashes. She wore a simple blue dress, practical but well-fitted, and her hair, deep chestnut brown with lighter strands where the sun had touched it, was pinned in a practical knot at her nape. "Evening, ma'am," Caleb said, keeping his hands visible. "Caught by the weather, I'm looking for shelter for the night for myself and my horse." She studied him for what felt like minutes before her posture relaxed slightly. "You armed?" Her voice carried a faint accent he couldn't place, something Eastern with polish to it. "Yes, ma'am," no point lying about what she could plainly see. "Good, you'd be a fool not to be." She lowered her rifle barrel toward the ground. "I've got a lean-to attached to the barn. You can put your horse there and sleep in the hayloft. I don't invite strangers into my home." "Fair enough," he dismounted slowly. "I'm Caleb Kincaid." Something flickered across her face, caution, perhaps curiosity. "Zara Oliver," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Thank you for the hospitality, Miss Oliver." "Mrs.," she corrected, then after a pause. "Though there hasn't been a Mr. Oliver for some time." The information hung between them, neither question nor explanation. Caleb simply nodded, sensing this wasn't a story offered freely to strangers. "There's a pump behind the barn. Water your horse, then come to the porch. I'll bring you something hot to eat." With that, she disappeared back inside, leaving Caleb to wonder what a woman, who couldn't be older than 23 or 24, was doing alone in this isolated stretch of Wyoming territory. The lean-to proved sturdy and clean, with fresh straw and a trough. After settling his gelding and retrieving his saddlebags, Caleb made his way to the porch, stamping snow from his boots. The door opened before he could knock, and Zara handed him a steaming plate of beans, salt pork, and cornbread. "You can eat out here," she said, not unkindly. "Water's in the dipper." Caleb took the plate gratefully. "I appreciate this." Zara hesitated in the doorway, her face half illuminated by the lamplight behind her. Something about his expression must have reassured her, because instead of retreating inside, she stepped onto the porch and leaned against the railing. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Raven Creek." "Signed on with the Circle M for the winter." She nodded. "McKenna's outfit, they're decent folks." "You know them." "I know most everyone within 50 miles, have two living out here alone." Caleb ate silently for a moment, then ventured. "That's a fair piece of land you've got, hard for one person to manage." Her chin lifted slightly. "I manage just fine." "I'm sure you do." He finished his plate and set it aside. "How long have you been out here?" 3 years. She turned to watch the snow falling more heavily now. "Sometimes it feels like 30. The weariness in her voice struck him. Not physical exhaustion, he recognized that from his own long days in the saddle, but something deeper, the bone weariness of carrying something heavy for too long. 3 years alone is a long time, he said carefully. "Alone is safer," she glanced at him. You look like a man who might understand that." The observation caught him off guard. Most people saw only what he showed them, a capable cowhand, nothing more, nothing less. This woman had somehow glimpsed beneath the surface in the span of a single meal. "I do," he admitted, "been riding solo since the war ended." "The war took my brothers," she said, "all three of them." "Different battles, same result." She pushed away from the railing. "You can wash at the pump in the morning, leave the plate on the porch when you go." "Much obliged," Caleb said, but she had already slipped back inside, the latch clicking firmly behind her. In the hayloft, wrapped in his blankets with his saddle for a pillow, Caleb found himself wondering about the widow Oliver. She was too young to have been married long, too refined to be born to frontier life, and too capable to have been dropped here without resources. A contradiction wrapped in a mystery, her eyes holding secrets he had no business wanting to unravel. The storm lasted 3 days. Caleb woke the first morning intending to leave, only to find visibility reduced to arm's length and the temperature plummeting. When he trudged through knee-deep snow to the cabin to return his breakfast plate, Zara looked him over and simply said, "You'll stay until it passes." It wasn't a request, and arguing would only prove him a fool. So he nodded, asked permission to check her woodpile, and spent that day splitting logs until his muscles burned with the effort. By evening, he'd stacked enough firewood by her door to last a month. She watched him from the window as he worked, occasionally disappearing only to emerge on the porch with coffee or a plate of food. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable, more like the quiet understanding between two people accustomed to their own company. On the second day, with the storm showing no sign of abating, Caleb noticed the roof of her small barn sagging dangerously under the weight of accumulated snow. Without asking, he found a ladder in the lean-to and cleared it, then reinforced a weak section of the roof beams. When he finished and climbed down, half frozen and completely soaked, Zara was standing in the barn doorway. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Roof would have collapsed by morning." He shrugged, trying to mask his shivering. She studied him, then sighed. "Come inside the house, you need to dry out before you catch your death." The interior of the cabin was spare but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, 2 chairs drawn up before it. A curtain separated what he assumed was her sleeping area from the main room. Everything was scrupulously clean and organized, from the few books on a small shelf to the tins and jars arranged on open kitchen shelving. "You can hang your coat and shirt by the fire," she said, turning away to give him privacy. "I'll make coffee." The warmth of the fire was glorious against his chilled skin. Caleb sat in the offered chair wearing only his woolen undershirt, his outer clothes steaming as they dried. "You didn't learn carpentry working cattle," Zara observed, handing him a mug of coffee. Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic. "My father was a carpenter before the war, taught me enough to be useful." "What happened to him?" "Sharpshooter at Cold Harbor," he sipped his coffee. "Yours?" "Influenza when I was 16, she settled into the chair opposite him. "My mother followed 6 months later. They say it was pneumonia, but I think it was just a broken heart." "I believe that can happen." She looked at him with those perceptive eyes. "You've seen it." "My mother after my father, nothing left for her to live for," she said, "not even me." The words slipped out before he could catch them, an admission he hadn't shared with another living soul. Zara didn't offer empty condolences or prying questions. Instead, she stared into the fire and said softly, "Loss marks a person, changes them." "Yes," he agreed. "It does." They sat in companionable silence until his clothes dried. As he dressed to return to the barn, Zara handed him a small package wrapped in cloth. "Biscuits and jerky," she explained. "In case you get hungry during the night." The small kindness warmed him more than the fire had. "Thank you." By the third day, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off pristine snow that covered every surface. Caleb knew he should leave. Circle M was expecting him, and he'd imposed on Zara's hospitality long enough. Yet as he saddled his horse, he found himself reluctant to go. Something about this woman and her solitary existence had gotten under his skin. He told himself it was merely curiosity about what had brought her to this lonely place, why she chose isolation when she clearly hadn't been born to it. He was securing his bedroll when he heard her approach. Zara stood in the barn doorway, a bundle in her hands. "I packed some food for your journey," she said. "It's a long ride to Raven Creek." "That's kind of you." He took the package, their fingers brushing briefly. "I should compensate you for your hospitality." Her eyes flashed, I don't need charity. It's not charity to pay for services rendered, Caleb countered mildly. Consider it a debt then, she said after a moment. Perhaps someday you'll pass through this way again and clear my roof or chop my wood. It was a gracious compromise, allowing him dignity without accepting his money. Deal. He extended his hand, and after a slight hesitation, she shook it. Her fingers were slender but strong, calloused from work. As he mounted up, Caleb found himself searching for a reason to return, something to connect them beyond this chance encounter. If you need anything from town, he offered, I could bring it when I come back this way. Zara looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. For a moment he thought she might refuse, but then she said, I could use some coffee beans. And perhaps some writing paper. Coffee beans and writing paper, he repeated, committing it to memory. Anything else? She hesitated, then added softly, perhaps, news. It gets quiet out here. The admission of loneliness, so carefully phrased, squeezed something in his chest. I'll bring you all the news I can carry. She nodded once, then stepped back from his horse. Safe travels, Mr. Kincaid. Caleb, he corrected, just Caleb is fine. Safe travels, Caleb. Her smile, the first he'd seen from her, transformed her face from merely pretty to something that caught his breath. Mind the north slope, it drifts deep after storms. He tipped his hat and turned his horse toward Raven Creek, aware that for the first time in years, he had somewhere specific he wanted to return to. Circle M Ranch proved to be everything Caleb expected: hard work, fair pay, and minimal questions about his past. The foreman, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, recognized competence when he saw it and assigned Caleb to breaking the younger horses that would be needed for spring roundup. The work suited him. Caleb had always had a way with horses, an intuitive understanding of their fears and needs. In the cold winter days he established a rhythm: mornings in the breaking corral, afternoons mending tack and helping with ranch maintenance, evenings playing cards or reading by the bunkhouse stove. Yet his thoughts frequently drifted to the small cabin and its solitary occupant. True to his word, when he rode into town for supplies 3 weeks after arriving at Circle M, he purchased coffee beans, writing paper, and a newspaper. Then, after a moment's consideration, he added a small packet of peppermint sticks and a blue hair ribbon that matched the dress she'd worn when they first met. That for your sweetheart? The shopkeeper asked with a knowing smile. Just a neighborly gesture, Caleb replied, uncomfortable with the assumption but unable to explain the peculiar connection he felt to a woman he barely knew. He set out the following morning, telling Murphy he'd be gone overnight to deliver some items to a neighbor. The foreman merely nodded, not one to pry into a man's personal business as long as the work got done. The ride to Zara's cabin took most of the day. As he crested the final rise and saw smoke curling from her chimney, Caleb felt an unexpected surge of anticipation. The snow had settled considerably since his last visit, packed down by time and wind, making travel easier. He was halfway across the open field when the cabin door opened and Zara stepped out, rifle in hand. She lowered it immediately upon recognizing him, and something like pleasure crossed her face before she composed her expression. You came back, she said as he dismounted. Said I would. He retrieved the package of supplies from his saddlebag, brought your coffee and paper, and a few other things I thought you might like. She accepted the package with both hands, treating it like something precious. Thank you. Would you like to come in? I was just making stew. The invitation, so casually offered, indicated a shift in their relationship. No longer a storm-stranded stranger, he had somehow become something closer to a friend. Inside, the cabin was much as he remembered, though a few changes caught his eye: fresh evergreen branches in a jar on the table, adding a pleasant scent to the air, and what appeared to be a new quilt draped over the back of one chair. You've been busy, he observed, nodding toward the quilt. Winter nights are long. She set the package on the table but didn't open it. How is Circle M? Good outfit, fair people. He hung his coat on a peg by the door. Murphy, that's the foreman, has me breaking some young stock for spring. You're good with horses. Better than I am with people most days, he admitted with a small smile. She stirred the pot hanging over the fire. I find that hard to believe. Why's that? You're easy to talk to, she glanced at him. I don't usually find that to be the case with visitors. Do you get many? No, she ladled stew into 2 bowls. By design. Over dinner, Caleb shared news from town. A new school teacher had arrived, the mercantile was expanding. There'd been talk of the railroad pushing a spur line through the valley next year. Zara listened with obvious interest, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind and broader knowledge than most in these parts. "You weren't born out here," he said finally, the observation that had nagged at him since they met. She tensed slightly. "No, Boston originally. Long way from Boston to Wyoming." Yes, she didn't elaborate, and something in her expression warned against pressing further. Instead, he gestured toward the package she still hadn't opened. "Aren't you curious what else I brought?" The wariness in her eyes softened. "I didn't want to seem greedy." "It's not much," he assured her, "just a few small things." She untied the string and carefully unwrapped the parcel, laying out each item with deliberate movements: the coffee beans, the writing paper, the newspaper. When she uncovered the peppermint sticks and blue ribbon, her fingers stilled. "These weren't necessary," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but they reminded me of you." Color touched her cheeks. "Thank you." She lifted the ribbon, running it through her fingers. "It's been a long time since anyone gave me a gift." The simple statement, devoid of self-pity but heavy with loneliness, made something twist in Caleb's chest. He'd chosen isolation. She seemed to have had it thrust upon her. "Why here?" he asked suddenly. "Of all places, why settle alone in this valley?" Zara's fingers stilled on the ribbon. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she raised her eyes to his. "I asked you if you thought snow could hide a person's past," she said quietly. Caleb frowned, not recalling such a question. "Did you?" "When?" "Just now in my mind." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I've been wondering if that's why I came here, for the snow and the silence and the distance from everything I once knew." "And did it work? Did the snow hide whatever you're running from?" Her gaze was steady. "For 3 years it has." "But snow melts eventually, doesn't it?" "Yes," he agreed, "it always does." She looked down at the ribbon in her hands. "What about you, Caleb Kincaid? What are you hiding from in all this wilderness?" The directness of her questions startled him. Most people on the frontier respected the unspoken rule: a man's past was his own business unless he chose to share it. "Who says I'm hiding?" he countered. "A man like you, educated, skilled, could have settled anywhere. Could have built something permanent. Instead, you drift from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots." She tilted her head. "That suggests you're either running from something or toward something you haven't found yet." Caleb felt uncomfortably exposed, as if she'd read pages from a book he kept carefully closed. "Maybe I just prefer my freedom." "Maybe," she conceded. "Or maybe you're like me, afraid that if you stay too long in one place, the snow will melt and reveal everything you've tried to bury." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. For years he'd told himself his wandering was about independence, about the cowboy's natural restlessness. But Zara had named his secret fear with unsettling accuracy. "What if," he said slowly, "what's buried deserves to stay that way?" "Does it?" Her eyes searched his. "Or are we just afraid of what others might think if they knew?" "Sometimes both," he admitted. She nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. "It's getting late," she said, rising to clear their bowls. "You're welcome to the hayloft again." "Thank you." He stood, sensing the moment for confidences had passed. "I should see to my horse." Outside in the crisp night air, Caleb leaned against the barn wall and looked up at the stars. Zara Oliver had seen through him with disconcerting ease, recognizing a kindred spirit where he'd thought himself unreadable. The realization was both unsettling and oddly liberating, to be truly seen, perhaps for the first time since the war. He didn't know what secrets she was hiding in this remote valley, but he recognized the weight of carrying them alone. Because despite his carefully constructed solitude, Caleb carried his own burdens. The face of the Confederate boy no older than 16 he'd shot at Chancellorsville, the girl in Kansas who'd believed his promises before he'd realized he couldn't settle down. The brother he couldn't save from prison after a cattle rustling gone wrong. These were the ghosts that kept him moving, the memories that made permanent connections seem impossible. Yet something about Zara's quiet strength and self-contained dignity called to him, suggesting there might be understanding rather than judgment for the man he'd been and the things he'd done. As he settled into the hayloft for the night, Caleb made a decision. Come morning, he would tell Zara he'd like to visit again, not just to bring supplies or news, but because for the first time in years, he'd found someone worth returning to. The winter days passed with surprising swiftness. True to his word, Caleb made the journey to Zara's cabin every 2 weeks, weather permitting. Each visit followed a similar pattern. He would arrive bearing small gifts and news. She would welcome him with increasingly evident pleasure, and they would spend the evening in conversation that gradually revealed more of themselves to each other. He learned that she played the piano beautifully, though she hadn't touched one in years. She discovered his fondness for poetry, particularly Walt Whitman, whose verses he could recite from memory. These small revelations built a bridge between them, spanning the careful distance they both maintained from the rest of the world. By his fourth visit, in early February, something had shifted in their relationship. Zara no longer kept her rifle close when he arrived. She'd begun to share stories of her childhood in Boston, her strict father, her doting brothers, her love of sailing in the harbor. She never mentioned a husband, and Caleb never asked, sensing that wound was still too raw to probe. For his part, Caleb found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years, tales of growing up in Missouri, his father's carpentry shop, his mother's garden. He even spoke of the war, though he carefully avoided the darkest moments. Those he kept buried under his own blanket of snow. On a particularly bitter evening in late February, with the wind howling around the cabin's corners, they sat before the fire drinking coffee laced with whiskey from a bottle he'd brought from town. "Why did you never remarry?" Caleb asked suddenly, the question emerging before he could reconsider. The whiskey had loosened his tongue, though not enough to excuse the intrusion. Zara's hand stilled on her cup. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "That's none of my business." "No, it's all right," she stared into the fire. "I suppose I wasn't ready, and out here there aren't many opportunities." "There must have been suitors. A woman like you, with land and obvious capabilities." A shadow crossed her face. "There were offers, none that I cared to accept." Something in her tone suggested these offers had been less than gentlemanly. Caleb felt a surge of protectiveness, followed quickly by confusion at his own reaction. Zara Oliver was not his to protect or feel possessive about, regardless of the growing attachment he felt toward her. "And you," she asked, turning the question back on him, "no wife waiting somewhere?" "No," he swirled the amber liquid in his cup. "Came close once, girl named Elizabeth in Dodge City. Her father owned the mercantile." "What happened?" "I left, the simple truth unembellished. Couldn't see settling down then, or maybe just couldn't see settling down with her." "Do you regret it?" He considered the question honestly. "No, she married the banker's son 6 months later. They have 3 children now and a fine house in town. She got the life she wanted." "And you got your freedom. Such as it is," he looked at her directly. "Though lately I've been wondering if freedom and loneliness aren't just different words for the same condition." The firelight played across her features, softening them. In that moment, with her guard lowered by whiskey and companionship, Zara looked younger than her 23 years, almost vulnerable. "I've been alone so long," she said softly, "I sometimes forget what it feels like not to be." Without thinking, Caleb reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her fingers were cool despite the fire's warmth, and they tensed briefly before relaxing in his grasp. "You're not alone tonight," he said. They sat that way for a long while, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers. Neither spoke again, but something profound had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider. When Caleb finally rose to retire to the barn, Zara walked him to the door. In the shadowed entryway, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For coming back, for seeing me." The words carried a weight beyond their simplicity. Impulsively, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'll always come back, Zara, as long as you want me to." A promise he hadn't intended to make, but one he realized he meant with every fiber of his being. The early spring thaw came suddenly in March, transforming the frozen landscape with alarming speed. Streams that had been silent for months roared with snowmelt, and the roads turned to muddy quagmires that made travel treacherous. Caleb watched the changing conditions with concern, knowing Zara's cabin sat near enough to Bear Creek that flooding could be a real danger. When Murphy announced that all hands were needed to move cattle to higher ground, Caleb volunteered to ride to the outlying homesteads and warn them of potential flooding. It was the excuse he needed to check on Zara without raising questions about his relationship with the widow who lived alone. The journey took twice as long as usual, his horse struggling through mud that sometimes reached above its fetlocks. By the time he reached the valley where Zara's cabin stood, Caleb's concern had grown to genuine worry. Bear Creek had already jumped its banks in places, and the water ran swift and dangerous. He urged his tired mount forward, cresting the final hill that overlooked her property. Relief flooded through him at the sight of her cabin, still dry on its slight rise, but the creek behind it had swollen to twice its normal width. Another day of melt like this and the water would reach her door. Zara emerged from the barn as he approached, her skirts tucked up practically and a worried frown on her face. "Caleb," she hurried toward him. "What are you doing here in this weather?" "Came to warn you about the flooding," he said, dismounting with a splash. "Bear Creek's rising fast." "I've been watching it," she glanced toward the swollen waterway. "But I didn't think it would reach the cabin." "It might not," he conceded, "but I'd rather not take chances. Do you have somewhere you can go, friends in town?" She shook her head. "I haven't exactly cultivated close relationships." "Then you'll come back with me to Circle M." Mrs. McKenna would welcome another woman's company, and you'd be safe there until the waters recede. Zara's expression closed. "I can't leave my home." "Zara, be reasonable." "This is all I have," she interrupted, an edge of desperation in her voice. "Everything I own is here." "I can't just abandon it." Caleb studied her face, seeing beyond the stubborn set of her jaw to the fear beneath. This cabin represented more than shelter to her. It was security, identity, perhaps the only thing truly hers in a world that had taken much from her. "All right," he said finally, "then we'll stay and protect it, but we need to move quickly. We should get your valuables to higher ground and reinforce the doors and windows against water." Relief crossed her features. "Thank you for understanding." They worked through the afternoon, moving her most precious possessions to the cabin's small loft, her books, a wooden box she wouldn't open in his presence, a framed photograph of three young men in Union Army uniforms that he assumed were her brothers. Outside, they piled sandbags made from feed sacks filled with dirt around the foundation. As evening approached, the creek rose another 6 inches. Standing on the porch, watching the water's inexorable advance, Caleb made a decision. "I'm staying tonight," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "If the water reaches the cabin, you might need help." Zara looked like she might protest, but a distant crack of thunder changed her mind. "You're welcome to stay," she said instead, "but not in the barn, it's too close to the creek, you can sleep here." The offer of shelter within her home, rather than the barn or hayloft, marked another threshold crossed between them. Caleb nodded his thanks, too tired from their labors to make much of the significance. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, listening to the rain that had begun to fall in earnest. Every few minutes, Caleb would check the creek's progress from the window, his expression growing more concerned each time. "It's coming up faster than I expected," he admitted after his fourth check. "We should prepare for water in the cabin before morning." Zara's face paled, but she nodded resolutely. "What should we do?" "Move what we can to the loft. Be ready to leave if necessary." He hesitated, then added gently, "Zara, if the water reaches the cabin floor, we may have to go. No possession is worth your life." She bit her lip, then nodded again. "I know, but this place. It's more than just a cabin to me." "I understand," and he did more than she might realize. In a life of transience, having something permanent, something that belonged only to you, was precious beyond measure. They worked in silence, moving furniture and supplies to the highest points in the cabin. Outside, the storm intensified, rain hammering against the roof and windows with increasing fury. By midnight, they had done all they could do, and exhaustion claimed them both. "You take the bed," Caleb insisted. "I'll sleep in the chair by the fire where I can keep an eye on the water." Too tired to argue, Zara retreated behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. Caleb stoked the fire one last time, then settled into the chair, his boots still on in case they needed to leave quickly. He must have dozed despite his intentions to stay alert, because the sound of water lapping against the porch steps jerked him awake with a start. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in shadowy darkness. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, and now he could hear the creek's angry rush much closer than before. Caleb moved to the window, straining to see in the darkness. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. Water had completely surrounded the cabin, and the first step of the porch was already submerged. The barn was half flooded, though the roof still stood above the waterline. "Zara," he called, moving toward the curtained alcove. "Zara, wake up." She emerged immediately, fully dressed, her hair hastily braided over one shoulder. One look at his face told her all she needed to know. "It's reached the cabin," she said flatly. "Just the steps so far, but it's rising fast. We need to be ready to leave." He hesitated. Is there anything else you need to bring? Anything irreplaceable? Her eyes darted to the wooden box they'd moved to the loft earlier. Just that, everything truly important is already up there. Good, get your warmest coat. I'll check how much time we have. When Caleb opened the front door, his heart sank. In the short time since he'd looked out the window, the water had risen to cover the entire porch and was now seeping under the door itself. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the roar of Bear Creek had become a constant thunder in the background. We can't wait, he said, closing the door against the deluge. The water's coming in already. We need to leave now while my horse can still get us to higher ground. Zara's face was pale but composed as she pulled on her coat and reached for the small bag she'd packed with essentials. The loft. There's no time, Caleb interrupted gently. The water's rising too fast. If it reaches the roof, being in the loft won't help us. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself, then nodded. All right. Caleb retrieved his gelding from where he'd tethered it on high ground behind the cabin. The animal was nervous, sensing the danger in the rising waters, but still trusted him enough to stand steady while he mounted and then helped Zara up behind him. Hold tight, he instructed as she wrapped her arms around his waist. We'll head for the ridge, it's our best chance. They set out into the storm, the horse picking its way carefully through water that sometimes reached its belly. Zara clung to Caleb, her face pressed against his back, while he focused on finding the safest path through the flooded valley. The journey seemed endless, each step fraught with the danger of hidden holes or debris that could send them all into the swirling water. Twice the horse nearly lost its footing, causing Zara to tighten her grip around Caleb's waist with a small sound of fear. Almost there, he assured her as they began to ascend the gentle slope that led to the ridge, just a little farther. When they finally reached high ground, Caleb found shelter beneath an overhanging rock face. It wasn't much, but it blocked the worst of the rain and wind. He helped Zara dismount, noting how she trembled from cold and fear. You're safe now, he said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders despite her protests. The water can't reach us here. In the faint light of approaching dawn, her face was streaked with rain and what might have been tears. She looked toward the valley, where her cabin was now just a dark shape in a sea of floodwater. Everything I worked for, she whispered, everything I built. The cabin's on high enough ground that the structure might survive, Caleb said, though he wasn't certain. And when the water recedes, I'll help you rebuild whatever's damaged. She turned to him then, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. Why would you do that for me? The question demanded honesty he hadn't been prepared to offer, but standing there in the gray dawn, having just risked his life to save hers, pretense seemed pointless. Because I care what happens to you, he said simply, more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. Something in her expression softened. I've spent 3 years keeping everyone at a distance, building walls higher than any floodwater could reach. I noticed, he said with a small smile, but you climbed them anyway. She shook her head slightly, wonder in her voice. Why? Maybe I recognize something in you that I understand all too well. He reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. The need to hide. The fear of being truly known. And if you knew me, truly knew me, would you still look at me the way you're looking at me now? Her voice wavered slightly. Yes, he said without hesitation. Nothing you could tell me would change what I feel. You can't know that. I can, he took her cold hands in his. Zara, we've all done things we regret, we've all made choices that haunt us. But whatever you're running from, whatever you're hiding from, it doesn't define you, not to me. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity against her fears. Then, with visible resolve, she said, My husband was a thief. A confidence man who stole from dozens of people, including my father's closest friends. When he was finally caught, I was implicated as his accomplice. The confession hung between them in the damp air. Caleb remained silent, giving her space to continue. I knew nothing of his schemes, she went on, her voice steadier now, but no one believed me. My family's reputation was destroyed. My husband hanged himself in his cell rather than face trial, leaving me alone to bear the shame and suspicion. So you came west, Caleb said quietly, to start over where no one knew your name. Yes, she looked toward the flooded valley. I used what little money I had left to buy that land, built the cabin with my own hands, learning as I went, became someone new, someone who belonged to no one, who owed nothing to anyone. That takes courage, he said. More courage than most possess. Or desperation, her smile was sad. For 3 years I've lived in fear that someone from Boston would recognize me, that my past would find me even here. Caleb considered her story, searching for any change in his feelings. He found none, only increased admiration for her resilience and a deeper understanding of her self-imposed isolation. "Thank you for trusting me," he said finally. "It can't have been easy." "It wasn't," she studied his face carefully. "You're not disgusted, you don't think less of me. For being deceived by someone you trusted, for having the strength to rebuild your life after everything collapsed." He shook his head. "How could I?" Relief washed over her features. "When I asked if snow could hide a past, that first night you stayed, I was really asking myself if I could ever stop running. If I could ever trust anyone with the truth. And now? Now I know the answer." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath against his chin. "The snow doesn't hide anything forever, but maybe. Maybe that's not always a bad thing." In the growing light of dawn, with the storm finally beginning to abate, Caleb Kincaid did what he'd been wanting to do for weeks. He lowered his head and kissed Zara Oliver. Her lips were cold from the rain, but softened immediately against his, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they parted, something had fundamentally changed between them. The last barriers had fallen, leaving only the truth of what they felt for each other, unobscured by secrets or fear. "When the water recedes," Caleb said softly, "I'm going to help you rebuild. And then, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay." Her eyes widened. "What about Circle M, your job?" "Jobs are plentiful for a man who knows horses, but finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, and accepts all that you are." He shook his head. "That's rare beyond measure." "Are you certain?" she asked, hope and caution warring in her voice. "You've spent years avoiding attachments." "As have you," he countered gently. "Perhaps we've both been hiding long enough." The sun broke through the clouds then, illuminating the flooded valley below them. Already the water seemed to have stopped rising, and in time it would recede, leaving mud and debris but also the chance to start anew. "Yes," Zara said, turning back to him with the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "I think perhaps we have." 3 months later, on a perfect June afternoon, Caleb stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, their cabin now, and watched Zara tending the vegetable garden they'd planted together. The flood had damaged much of the original structure, but together they had salvaged what they could and constructed something stronger in its place. Circle M had been sorry to lose him, but Murphy had understood when Caleb explained about the widow whose property needed rebuilding, and about the man who'd finally found a reason to stop drifting. McKenna himself had insisted on sending men to help with the reconstruction, turning what might have been months of work into mere weeks. The new cabin was larger than the original, with proper glass windows Caleb had ordered from Denver and a stone foundation designed to withstand future floods. Inside, Zara's belongings mingled with his own sparse possessions in a way that felt right, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their proper places. They had married quietly in Raven Creek, with the McKennas as witnesses and the local preacher officiating. No grand celebration, just a simple ceremony followed by a meal at the town's only restaurant. Afterward, they had ridden home together. Home, a word Caleb had almost forgotten the meaning of until Zara. Now, watching her work in the rich soil left behind by the flood, he felt a contentment he'd never thought possible. The wandering cowboy and the solitary widow, both hiding from their pasts, had somehow found in each other the courage to build a future. Zara looked up, sensing his gaze, and smiled, that full, uninhibited smile that never failed to catch his breath. She set down her trowel and walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Kincaid," she said as she climbed the steps to join him on the porch. "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied, drawing her into his arms. "That a snowstorm stranded me here, that you didn't shoot me on sight." She laughed, the sound still new enough to delight him. "I considered it, you know, for at least a moment." "I'm glad you reconsidered," he pressed a kiss to her forehead. "So am I," she leaned against him, fitting perfectly against his side as they looked out over their land. The creek had returned to its normal banks, the fields were greening nicely, and in the distance the mountains stood sentinel against the sky. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Boston, I mean the city." "Civilization." Zara considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes I miss certain things, music, theater, the smell of the ocean, but Boston wasn't home anymore, not after everything that happened." She looked up at him. "This is home now." "You are." The simple declaration warmed him more than the summer sun. "And you're mine," he said, "the home I didn't know I was looking for." They stood together as the afternoon stretched into evening, watching shadows lengthen across their land. The snow that had brought them together was long melted, exposing what lay beneath, not secrets to be feared, but the solid foundation of truth on which they had built their life together. And in that moment, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he'd been searching for all along, without even realizing he was looking. Not just a place to belong, but a person to belong to. A woman who had asked if snow could hide a past, and a man who had wanted to know hers. Now they both had their answers, written not in snow that would inevitably melt, but in the lasting promises they had made to each other, to accept, to forgive, to love without condition or reservation. Together they had built something neither flood nor fire, nor the ghosts of the past could ever wash away.